podcast listeners, if you hear my voice right now, I need you to do something for me. I want you to take out your phone or on your computer, go to Apple Podcasts, search for Ask Your Old Head podcast. You'll see my logo, my little picture, my little image there. Find the show. Please rate and write a review. It's a small thing, but it helps others find this work and find what I'm doing here. And it really, really matters, as small as that may seem. So if you could please do that before we get into the show, I would much appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Let's get into it. Peace. Peace. I'm Majestic.
My brother, Justice Raji.
All right. So, unlike our overall, well, I guess our presumption, our perception of the speed of vote counting is distorted because, at least I know all of my life, they would be on the news and it'd be like, and at 12 p.m., 12 midnight, we've declared this person the president or, whatever, based on reporting from 7 districts, whatever. There was no action.
Right. It used to happen kind of fast. We would figure it out.
Yeah, but also, but even then, when we were told that, the actual certification was like 2-3 weeks after. Like it was never actually, like it was.
Yeah, it was never
fair. Like number, like the counting wasn't really done, I guess is what I'm saying. But in any event, I think we, just due to, we still live in a representative democracy, and this was election week. I think, let's get a couple words in on the recent election, and I think significantly where I would want to start with is the assumed red wave. It didn't happen. It was some flips and some blips and some things, but the Republican Party, the conservative movement would storm the gates, so to speak. Well, I guess that might be in bad taste. Give it the last.
Yeah, that was a little tough. Man.
That was a little tough on them. Man, they earned it. That's on them. They run with them people. Stop hanging out with people that want to storm buildings and attack Congress people. I'm just saying. That's you. That's who you kick it with. It didn't happen. And it was interesting to me. I've always, the first thing that it made me think about was like the way we get information about what's happening right in the world. And I think at times we've touched on this in like our information channels, but particularly as it pertains to polling, there's always the assumption that whoever's doing the polling, I guess, there's like conservative polls and there's liberal polls and, leaning, and there's some polls that are considered more middle of the road. But generally, it's a survey. It's selective data gathering, like you're doing some process to get that data and then reporting out these projections. And I've always myself been like suspicious, like, I don't recall. I think I may have been polled a couple times. Maybe. I don't know. It's like one of these like,
man, they ain't called, man. They saw your name, they ain't calling you, man. Let's not even act like you got polled, man. This is America, Jack. You know how people got polled and why they got polled. And I'm going to be reminding us of this conversation in the words of John Amos in Coming to America. This is America, Jack. Because there are fundamental things you had to remember about how this stuff goes in this country that has everything to do with that 4-word phrase. But please continue on.
Yeah. So just generally, from the looks of things, if Warnock wins his runoff, which is likely because runoffs are about getting people to come back out and vote again, and I don't know how many people go come back out and vote for Herschel Walker, like just real talk. And so boys like, look, I tried. This dude's terrible. I tried though. You know what I'm saying? If I can imagine some like on the edge conservative cat who maybe wasn't really into either one of these people was like, yeah, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And then it's like, yeah, we need you to come back out in a month and vote again. Like, word. They wouldn't say word. They would say something else, but they would say like for real or something. But, generally you have a situation where the Democratic Party could hold on, what could have actually a full actual majority in the Senate, meaning a majority without the vice president, which to my understanding changes the way like the committees work and everything else, because now you like have, you don't have to do a 50-50 thing or something with so internal.
Yeah, you don't have to cut. I mean, when you have the 50-50 thing, the vice chairs are much more powerful, frankly, versus the vice chairs in a situation where where you got like a vote or two, a breathing room, right? The vice chair is still important, but not as important when you got that 50-50.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, and then in the House, I haven't looked up it basically, it's not it's like a, if the numbers of my understanding, if I remember at the time of this recording correct, like, you know, the Republican Party may have a 1 or 2 seat lead, but it's basically not enough to be like the people that's super wacko in the party. You can't isolate them because you're gonna need all their votes all the time, which means, I mean, you know, largely the House may not get anything done for the next 2 years. What it looks like to me, and or you know, in an optimistic framing, maybe maybe people will actually focus on, like, you know, doing the people's work and resolving societal issues, as opposed to having an ongoing cultural war about how you want to control and dominate people in your own vision. I don't know. It could go any way, but hopefully
This is America, Jack.
America.
Listen, listen, man. What this does to me is it makes some part of the Republicans of the House conference really strong in the same way Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema became really strong in the Senate, where the vast majority of people may have been somewhere else, but at the end of the day, you need every vote. And if you think about doing that in whipping every vote, and not saying that Representative McCarthy can't do it, he's been the minority leader, but you know, it only takes a brief look at the history in the last 10 years to look at Representative Ryan and Representative Boehner to see the complications with keeping the Republican conference together. Mm-hmm. And that's to say the least. I mean, we got books about it, about how difficult it is to keep the conference together, given that it actually, I would argue, has a wider, as much as we talk about the big tent of the Democrats, right? And we often bemoan what that means. And some people say kick some people out the tent. Some people say make the tent bigger because that's the only way you're going to win in a center right country, which I'm kind of frankly thinking America, frankly, is more right now. That the Republican tent is huge. Like, you have people who believe in not just your garden variety fairy tales, but your real fairy tales, right? All the way over to people who are socially liberal but financially conservative, right? And so keeping a conference together like that, but being able to be hijacked by the Freedom Caucus because you need every one of their votes, right? I think it's going to be a real challenge. And you know, this is more of a thing of just my respect for Representative Pelosi, Congresswoman Pelosi. Like, I don't think McCarthy's as good as she is with keeping the group together. So I think, regardless if they're up 1 or 2, I think they'll be hijacked by that last vote, which means that anything that comes across will be a mismatch and will never get in and won't move in the Senate anyway. And basically it protects the Senate because the Senate won't have to bring anything up because it'll die with the Senate all the time.
Right. It'll be like, yeah, it ain't gonna pass. it'd be like, yeah, this is our idea. We're gonna you might as well just go and hold that player. We ain't doing that. It ain't getting out of this building. It's also, I think, the thing that, you know, watching it happen is like, you know, we as I think it's safe to say, as you know, Black men of certain age and as Black folks who come from, you know, families, at least to some, you know, varying degrees, have been politically aware for a while and active on, you know, beyond our own generation, sort of like a, you know, this is what they're reporting on the news. I wouldn't really believe that, but it might be true, right? So when you get to these projections and like how people are going to vote and why people are voting, Um, as much as the age old, trope in This Is America, Jack, of like crime. They go to and I was home watching, and I don't watch a lot of stuff that has commercials because I do all the streaming things and I pay that extra $4 or whatever it is to not see commercials. So, outside of watching sporting events, I don't see commercials. So I'm home. It's just like, you would think that there was like a Grand Theft Auto style roving gangs of people like hijacking houses. What I mean? It's just the news would have you believe like it's impending doom, right? If we don't do something now, and just the way people were framed up, this person crazy as a such and such, brought to you by people who don't want to really say their name out loud, but they want you to vote for the other person, like all of those types of ads, but no real focus on like underlying root causes, structural issues, and I understand you can't, I guess, I think people say you can't put that in a commercial, but my point being, how do we trust these vehicles, and I'll give you an example. So when I went to Netroots Nation last summer, it was my favorite panel. I went to, had three different, brother from the Black Male Voter Project. I'm going to get everyone's names and put them somewhere because I just popped back in my head, so I don't remember all four of the folks. So the moderator, and then two sisters. One sister that's like a researcher type, does like stuff, and the other sister who's like long time organizer and various different levels. And everything was just that, like, when it comes to Black people and what we actually are doing and voting and thinking, most of the vehicles that we have for people to know what we're thinking and doing are not sufficient. They just don't know. That people don't campaign to us the right way across the spectrum. I mean? Not just like, we've talked about kind of the way Black men are engaged in the political process. But like generally there's stuff just assumed about us. And I always feel like some of these like articles on polling, especially sort of in like the New York Times, like, part of me goes, are they focusing on this to get me to read the paper? Or are they focusing on this because it's actually a possible, like a really real outcome? And we got to remember these things are still products that people sell, right? And then, you get the, people's criticism was it 538, that they do their little tables and stuff, and people, rightly say like, yeah, they don't ask the best questions possibly as it pertains really to know what Black folks are really going to do, right? And I still think that there's such a need for the development of how, even for our own benefit, like we know what our community actually is thinking politically. I mean? The exit polling that's come out is basically pointed to, yeah, still pretty much at the rate that we do. Black people voted for the Democrat that was running in most of these like battleground states and these other places. There's other people that may have voted in various ways, especially older folks. And then the other data that has come out so far is that young people, people under 29, under 30, I think 60%, 63% voted. It's more, to the Democratic side of the ticket, and abortion and other related things like that being a big part of that motivation, at least perceived. I'm sure more will come out on that. But I guess what I'm saying is, how does, when you see these different polling things and reports, like how does that impact you when you think about like what's about to happen in the election cycle?
Yeah, so a couple things with this. One, want to go back to you a little bit about the crime issue. There is not a debate. I mean, there's, from what I've seen from being in a number of big cities in America, that for a variety of reasons post pandemic, that kind of incidences of crime or incidences of things, more I would say this, it's not to say crime, it's incidences of things that make people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Mm.
And I think those are two different things from crime, because I want to touch on that. In downtowns across America, there are incidences of things that make you feel uncomfortable that you didn't see pre-pandemic. That could be people without addresses, folks who are dealing with mental and emotional health challenges. So you see those kind of things, and they are affecting downtowns across America. That's not a debate. That's not like a made up thing. Again, because they are very real societal and structural reasons, you're seeing these things when before you didn't see them. So part of it is you have to ask the question, why didn't you see them before?
Mm-hmm.
Where were they at? Right. So that is one thing. The other part of it is whenever they show these pictures, they show these like people shooting in places and stuff like that. It's important to remember they're showing neighborhoods where this stuff is happening to other Black and brown people. Like this stuff is not happening to them in their neighborhoods, right? It's happening to Black folks. And you're using the tapes because we're taping everything now, right?
Right.
Everything is on tape. And we're taping events that are heinous. They're heinous. I mean, don't make no mistake. They're heinous and negative, and they are harmful to people. But the fact they're using it to talk about to elect someone that's not going to resolve that happening in Black communities.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to do that. So you're putting fear in people about things around real crimes that are happening in those places. Now, the incidences of general lack of comfortability and how that impacts some cities, not all, but some cities with office, return to office work is a real thing. That's not a made up concept. So that's one. I just want to make that distinction. Two, we have Cornell. Cornell Belcher was really known and probably America's most well-known Black pollster. Constantly talks about guarding against this assumption of how Black folks vote based upon one election.
Mm-hmm.
And meaning there was something different about Donald Trump. Like that is, I think that is clear and direct in the research, right? Like Donald Trump moved people to vote, moved some Black men and some Latino men to vote for the Republican Party. That doesn't mean the Republican Party is doing better with Black men. And I think that nuance is lost in our dialogues. People saw Donald Trump. He's been successful, sure. And, next conversation, we could talk about the Dave Chappelle Saturday Night Live monologue. But one of the things he touches on is like Donald Trump is an honest liar. He told you exactly who he was and exactly what he was going to do. And there's a set of people who like stuff like that. There's a set of men who like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think we've misconstrued a vote for Donald Trump in the presidential election for this migration away from the Democratic Party, for whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of this, and this is an in-house conversation, which obviously ain't in-house because we're about to put it on the internet. But in the Black community, on social media, there's all these debates about how Black men don't step up to vote for people. And there's this premise that Black women are delivering things that Black men, for whatever reason, are not. And I think that that conversation, again, if it did happen in 2016, and if we argue that the percentages were 5 or 6% different for men and women, I mean, percentages of men and women in their voting patterns are different. They're not the same, right? Like white men and white women don't vote the same percentage on things.
Yeah.
Latino men and Latino women don't vote the same percentage on particular issues. That's a gender challenge. That's not a racial challenge as much as we would like to think it is. So I think we do have that challenge that every time we don't see something, and because Stacey Abrams didn't win, the assumption is like, because she was a Black woman, Black men deserted her, when the data is in that Black men did not desert her. Yeah. If there were people who had a actual value-based reasoning that they supported Kemp, then we have to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. We
have to be open and say, what is the reason that this set of people have said, hey, we are supporting Kemp? Was it finances? Was it conservatism? Was it, some of the stuff that Kemp has done in Georgia? I mean, we need to have a real conversation about that versus making it a blanket statement about Black men. Especially, again, as where Belcher said, and as you alluded to, the data doesn't kind of bear that out, right? And the last thing I'll say about this is like, when we're being given when we're not having the conversations internally to talk about what is important to us as a community, and kind of being framed to say that, like, because some of the people who are being floated to us as candidates from the Republican Party are either like crazy or you know what I mean, like the just deny that Barack Obama still is an American or any kind of variation of thing. We can lose the fact of what are the issues that our community cares about at what kind of like in what order, and how do we think about that. And I think it's infantilizing our politics, frankly.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's infantilizing that, you know, there's parties, there's issues, and there's values, and those are sometime aligned, but not all the time. And one thing I'll say, right, last thing about this is America, Jack. When we see, and everyone goes, for example, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and everyone's like, well, you know, white women let us down. I want to say something. White women didn't let you down. They performed in mass. They performed as they always do in regard to voting for anyone that's not named Barack Hussein Obama.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it up to everyone to figure out what some of those reasons are. But this is America, Jack. You should know that unless people feel really compelled, a certain segment of the population feels really compelled to vote against race, they are going to vote according to the long-standing premises of how Black people are perceived when it comes to leadership. And I just, anything else we tell ourselves is actually deluding ourselves with the actual history of voting in America.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always the like shock and awe of it all that people like, oh wow, they didn't vote. I'm like, I mean, I can't say I've been paying close attention since since the 80s, but I've been paying attention. and I have not seen a broad derivation from the idea that, like, most of the time, it's like, yeah, people get, they be outside, like, yeah, I'm voting with my issues and da da da, and then they get in the booth. It's like, I don't know about the black guy. I don't know about that black person. I'm gonna go ahead and go the other way. You know what I'm saying? It bears out statistically. It doesn't mean that no one who would identify as such votes, for diverse, candidates that are not white. It's still a consistent feature of our political apparatus that, particularly white folks, don't always vote for people of color, black folks especially. You know what I'm saying? It just is. However people feel about it, I think it means there's space to talk and engage in dialogue and deep thinking and deep learning and ask questions about that. And, maybe all the time, the values or the issues that the person think are most important line up, but we also know just in general in human development. And if you've ever read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the one book, it's over there on my shelf.
Absolutely.
We substitute in our minds, our brains, the way we function, we can substitute in the answer for a question with other pieces of information, even though we think we're using this different piece of information. But, oh yeah, I'm making this decision based on this, but you're really making it based on some other ideas. Even bearing out Wisconsin voting and Mandela Barnes. Good thing that you got so very close. But when you look down the ticket, it's like, yeah, man, the other Democrats who were not, man named Mandela, were right there. And he couldn't get over the edge. You know what I'm saying? It's I think, and maybe it will be the defining shape of this next decade, of like the continued work to move the United States away from its virulently racist past and the embedding of those ideas of the inferiority of black folks specifically and other brown folks, and in the attempt to totally erase, our indigenous brothers and sisters, indigenous communities. that it'll go, you know, maybe some of us start just working on like those are people over there and they have interests, and we'll get to this other place. Maybe that can be the defining conversation, or one of the defining conversations over the next 10 to 15 years of like how we move forward as a place on Earth. Not that that's not informed in any way by just like these outcomes being different than people expected. It's just my general outcome that the conversation about power and structure changes over time. And so when we were kids, we were, before our age of voting, it was very like, get Black folks in office. Like that was the movement. Just get them in office, like at a higher clip, and especially in spaces that we had not had previous representation. Because by the time of our youth, we've talked about like the number of Black mayors. You still had different like congressmen, congresspersons, because that was a level of impact that was more achievable, but we still didn't have any. I don't think we had any Blacks. We didn't, because Barack was one of the first Black senators since Reconstruction.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
not from Massachusetts.
Yeah, not from Massachusetts. Right. And so, in this time, the idea of seeing, even though it's still not as probably as high as people think it is in terms of representation, but I think the next layer is like, where people represented, but also what is the apparatus underneath them that supports them, to be there. I had an interesting conversation with my son about the ballot and about voting that got all off into stuff that wasn't even on the ballot, like term limits. And, in his big, I'll let him speak for himself at a future date, but the thing we were talking about was like, what's the value of term limits? I was like, well, on one hand, I mean, it can be cool, like to kind of force the situation where someone new needs to be in the slot. But it then sometimes gives more power to the apparatus that supports the slot, which may not be a good thing, right? And then on the other hand, sometimes it's dope if your neighborhood got somebody that basically has a lot of cachet and pull, and they're in a position to make some things happen for you. That's also a good thing. On the other hand, no disrespect to my super duper elders, but Chuck Grassley, being 89 years old and still representing wherever he's from, seems a little bit like they ain't got nobody new out there. That's not. I mean, respect. You want to be out here and be in the representative government, but at some point, we have a lot of super older than the populist folks running the country. And it begs to like make a little space for some other generations to get in here and be in positions of influence and decision making. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that one thing you make an interesting point about kind of where politics goes, and it's interesting that we talk about a lot of these waves and we talk about the values and definitely nationally, right? But then it's important to remember we've only had 3 Black governors ever.
Yeah. And the whole
right? Like
whole time. Only 3.
The whole time. The entire time. It's important for folks to 3 elected. Patterson, I think, in New York.
Was appointed to replace.
Well, yeah, was appointed. It's important, like Doug Wilder, DeVal Patrick, and Wes Moore. Yeah. That just won it in Maryland.
Yeah, which is pretty dope.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a really interesting thing, I think, juxtaposition, if you were to look at what happens in national politics in the relative context of the role of Black folks in particular in national politics, but running states may be a little different, and then how that impacts the outcomes of communities.
Mm-hmm.
And why it makes sense that some people will look and say, why do I care? Now, obviously, we've talked about a lot of reasons why you should care who runs the federal apparatus of your country.
Mm-hmm.
And its impact on laws being made, judges, and so forth. But it is true that a program probably will come to you faster from the state, county, or local level than it would, in your perception at least, from a federal level. Mm-hmm. And so, the idea of Maryland, and when you look at Maryland, particularly with Wes Moore, and thinking about Baltimore County, but then also obviously Prince George's County, Montgomery County. You know, Maryland is much like Pennsylvania in the sense of like you have these places with this huge black and brown populations, and then you have places that still feel like the Confederacy is a brewing possibility, right? Western Maryland, the border of Western Maryland and Western Pennsylvania can definitely feel like, it's people are still fixing for a change.
Yeah.
But that's so it is a role of thinking about that influence. And just the last thing about this whole the reality of voting is just because someone's comfortable watching you act or play a sport doesn't mean they're comfortable watching you have the controls to the means of operation.
Mm-hmm.
And we should not confuse the two. Right. And that is about is it about the systems that propagate the thing or the individual? Because also part of the challenge is when we're looking to vote for people, again, like Dave Chappelle said last night, Herschel Walker is observably stupid, like he is one of the few people that you got to go pretty far for your own family members to say that you shouldn't be in government.
Yeah.
There are very few people in the world that their own family members do not want them to win. And he is one of them. However, you still have a situation where there's a certain amount of folks who did not vote for Raphael Warnock. Even given that. Yeah. And frankly, the people who voted for Warnock, many of them did not vote for Stacey Abrams, which again has to be evaluated under, the call of the beloved John Amos. This is America, Jack.
Yeah. So, we ain't gonna go super long today. The closing thing I would say is one, it still shows to me we're gonna have a very interesting 2024 presidential experience. All right. Yeah. I got the time. I got the time right in my head. When the actual election
is 2024, baby. You got it.
It's gonna be a wild ride because I'm sure your man's is gonna try to run again
Tuesday. He popping out Tuesday, letting y'all know.
Yeah, and then your man's down in Florida. He's gonna run. I don't know who else. There's gonna be some other I'm not a wild boy Republican that goes in look, I'm totally like a normal dude that just wants a balanced budget. I'm trying to tell you. Believe me, fam. Listen, I'm not like those guys. For real, y'all can totally vote for me. I might say a couple off-putting things, but just enough to get my base, get those folks to come join.
You gotta write that in. I'm gonna say some crazy shit because I work for a crazy team.
He's gonna be winking. He's gonna be winking all hard and stuff. Believe me, I'm totally gonna just balance the budget. I am not, you know what I'm saying? I'm gonna just try to leave certain stuff alone. That's my plan. Don't vote for those guys. Vote for me. That's gonna be his. And if that dude can get through the primary, it'll be interesting. And I'm saying it's a dude because more than likely based on the nature of our patriarchy.
Based on the Republican Party,
it ain't gonna be. It's not going to be a woman. Now, maybe it will, but I doubt it. And I would love to be surprised. I would love it not to be. I'd love it to be.
Well, they have a built-in. The other thing is they have a built-in structure that functions a little differently, frankly, than the Democratic Party. I mean, I think in some ways probably better for the strength of the party, but probably less well for the possibilities of new people. I mean, but again, Donald Trump kind of confounded that whole politics. But
yeah,
Trump has already started calling Ron DeSantis desanctimonious.
Right.
So he already got it.
They already throwing shots. It's crazy. On the other side, well, it's two things. might be early to say, but for whatever Joe Biden's frustrations he may create and deeper philosophical discussions about what progressive politics versus standard liberal politics versus center left, center right, whatever. Joe be out here politicking, and I got a tip hat that he's this has never actually in our generate lifetime happened that the midterm didn't just crushingly go the other way. And, he may not have done a lot to make it that way, right? Because you can sometimes be the benefit of a wave of what's happening with the human dynamic. There's I actually got to grab the book. There was a investor cat that a book that came out recently, and I was listening to an interview of him, and he was like, "Listen, if you were a white male positioned as I was in the late 50s and 60s of this type of generation, you have ridden the most fantastic wave of economic development in human history. You did you did some good decisions, you made some choices, you made some good, but also you rode like one of the greatest financial waves in the history of the planet." So
I call that the Stacey King factor.
Yeah.
Like on the Bulls.
Right.
Like there's no doubt that you were a good enough basketball player to get to the NBA, but then you did just happen to be on some teams with the three of the greatest basketball players ever to play the game.
Right. Right. So you be proud of your work. Just don't be showing up like nobody's doing a speech like, and my contributions to our championship.
Like Stacey King. Remember Stacey King said he was gonna bring us championship to the goddamn Sixers, man. Anyway,
he was wild.
I digress.
So there's that, and then to be tabled for later discussion, the flipping of at the state level in Michigan. Was it Michigan, Minnesota, Maryland?
Maryland, yeah, Philadelphia. And I think we're gonna have Pennsylvania at least in the House.
Yeah, that's something I want to, because I think that the state level stuff is actually much more for a lot of us. Actually, the state level stuff is where your good ideas might go to crap. So I'd like us to revisit, but I need to learn more about what really is going down there, and then at some point, I'd love to talk about the city of Portland charter change and what that because it's actually quite interesting. But we'll say that for a later day.
I just want to note that like the West Coast political and structural stuff feels like when America decided it just wanted to be different. Like on the East Coast and the Midwest, kind of like, okay, you got charters that don't change, it never changes. Y'all kind of stuff be like, hey man, you want to change it? Cool, let's think about it. Who wants to vote to change something? Like in Pennsylvania, we keep talking about constitutional changes, and you have to get 65% of the vote changed and like 2 successive in order to change anything. And everyone knows you'll never get 65% of the people to vote for something in 2 successive presidential elections. Wow. So it just doesn't change. We're like the West, generally speaking. I mean, even the whole prop stuff, the fact you can recall people, like all that kind of stuff feels like what happened when the West Coast looked at the rest and was like, you know what? Maybe we should give ourselves some more outs than we do. So I would love to talk more about what that looks like.
Absolutely. And I would say I have a lot of, somewhat informed but speculative rationale for the like wide open electoral, well, we could just put that on the ballot that happens out here, where it'd be like, it also the amount of things where it's like nobody wants to hold that. They think it's a good idea. Like, well, can we get it on as a measure? And that way, me, politician, Jeff doesn't have to be the person who put their name on it, but we could send it to the voters. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's very, very interesting. But yeah. And I mean, I think in my lifetime, I've seen smaller cities, smaller municipalities, like the city of Beaverton, change their structure, their government, but it's like, city of 100,000 people. It's not, the biggest city in the state changing its government form, which was fantastically outdated. Just for the record. But it's going to be a very interesting what this looks like in come 2025. That would be basically the entire council and the mayor is going to get voted on that year. So it's going to be, I think, a very interesting political theater. So with that, we can wrap it up and get back to other things in the coming week. So, you know what I'm saying? So he's got something else. I see.
Yeah, again, I think we're going to touch on a couple things in the next couple weeks that are going to be interesting. But I would say the dialogue going forward about what happens in DC, and also just what you said about President Biden, take what you will of it, but there's probably, I can comfortably say that there's not been a Democratic president that has gotten as much done in 2 years as the Biden administration.
Yeah.
It may not look as hip, it may be, fraught with all kind of stuff, but literally there has not been a Democratic administration that has moved as much. And I think it reflects this idea of like, you might not like everything that happened, but you can't deny that it occurred and people actually made things occur and try to use government, broadly speaking, to benefit the populace. And the fact that would have been a space where we would have imagined that the next party would have taken over because of dissatisfaction, because of some psychological idea. And then also, I think there's going to be there's a really interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to having it with you, just about the classics of before of lore in music, but also like framing current music in the context of, I think, sometimes how we looked at past times of music, and then thinking about what we're hearing, because I think we're over inundated with music and over inundated with everything to the point where we don't know if what we're hearing today is actually good or not. Sometimes we call it real good, but without thinking about it. And sometimes we don't call it good because you just heard this other stuff yesterday. Mm-hmm. So I think, that juxtaposition of what that means from classics at another time, 50 years ago, to, kind of artists today.
Right up. All right. Yeah. Well, what we going to do it. You know what I'm saying? Go right through it. So with that, I'll say peace.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to Good Brothers. Thank you to my good brother, Majestic. Good Brothers is a part of the Ask Your Old Head podcast, and you can support the podcast by, number one, listening, sharing, but most importantly, by rating and subscribing. So wherever you listen to podcasts, please go in, put a rating, 5 stars, if that's the scale, always being the best, but also subscribe, and so we can, get those numbers up, make it discoverable to other people. You can also support the podcast by becoming a patron of me. That's Justice Raji. Just search me on Patreon and you'll find my page there. And you can, contribute in a regular way. The other way you can support, of course, is by visiting Ask Your Old Head on Etsy and grabbing an Art to Culture sweatshirt or a mug. Some other things coming, which may not stay on Etsy, may end up someplace else in the near future, but we'll see about that when we get there. Most importantly, though, please take something from the podcast. If you have questions or you want to give a comment or feedback, feel free to find Justice Raji on Instagram, Twitter. You can look up Ask Your Old Head on Facebook. All those channels are open to you to get some feedback to the show. And other than that, be safe. Election season is over. Now comes the next phase of actually people governing, hopefully responsibly. We'll see. So please tune in, and I'll talk to you next time. Peace.